conservative mayor. And they're carrying out very extensive conservative tax cuts because they're fiscal conservatives. The tax cuts, the New York Times pointed out in a small item, all benefit business. So by accident, all the tax cuts benefit business. Well, there are also tax increases, which are compensating for the tax cuts, but they don't call them tax increases. What they call them is, the phrase is reduction of subsidies for public transportation and for tuition in public universities. Well, subsidy itself is another interesting word, kind of like reform. It's a subsidy if public funds are used for public purposes. That's called a subsidy. It's not called a subsidy when they go to private wealth. That's reform or something. So they're cutting down subsidies for public transportation. Well, that's just a tax. You know, if you pay 20% more for getting on the subway, that's tax. Same if you pay higher tuition at City College. You know, and that's a highly regressive tax. So who rides the subways and who goes to City College? So what they're doing is cutting taxes for business, for the rich, and increasing taxes for the poor, which are going to compensate for that. And that's called fiscal conservatism and cutting government. Well, so it is across the board. You take, I'll come to other examples, but if you think about it, take a close look at the things that are called cutting government. You'll notice they quite characteristically have this property. The next element of the Washington Consensus is making the tax system more regressive. Okay, we don't have to talk about that. It's stated openly. The thing that isn't stated openly is the reason. This is supposed to be in order to increase investment and give everyone jobs. But it's a really weird way to do that. I mean, the country is already awash in capital. The people whose taxes are being cut don't know what to do with their money. If you want to increase growth, there's another approach that might be used, stimulate weak demand by progressive taxes. That is, put more money into the hands of people who can spend it. That increases growth. That would increase growth. But that's not the right way to do it. The right way to do it is by cutting financial gains so that you can have more speculation against currencies. So that's the second part, make the tax system more regressive. What about deregulation? Well, same effect. Deregulation is a cost-shifting measure. So, for example, if you deregulate, if you allow industries to, as they've done already, to deposit toxic wastes without cost, because you have deregulation, it increases their profits, but it also increases water and sewage rates, which is a regressive tax on everybody else who's got to pay that. Also, it has further costs. Some of them you can't estimate. For example, the costs in, say, health and quality of life and so on. No way to give numbers to those. And there's also going to be the eventual cost of cleanup, but that's going to be a public cost, remember. Incidentally, a good one, because when you clean up the wastes, that increases the gross national product, and we all like to see that go up. But the public will pay those costs. So what it is just another form of radical cost shifting. Increase wealth for the rich and decrease it for everyone else. So it fits the experiment's design. And in general, it's kind of like a short-term profit gain for some, very small sum, and a big cost for everyone else. What about deregulating the labor market? Well, same process. Actually, that was done by simply criminal behavior. The best review of this, I know, is in Business Week. The Reagan administration, as they point out, essentially informed the corporate world that they were not going to enforce the laws. There are laws, much hated laws like the Wagner Act that give you the right to organize, and the Reagan administration simply informed business they weren't going to enforce them. So the number of illegal firings went up by about a factor of 6, and similarly across the board. They also informed business they were not going to enforce the OSHA regulations, health and safety regulations. So the number of days lost to injury and the number of injuries and so on also shot up. And in fact, that was a great way to undermine unions and the right to organize, a whole pile of policies like that, which was part of deregulating labor markets. Another part of deregulation of labor markets is to make them what's called more flexible, meaning you don't have any security and no guarantees. Number of temporary workers goes way up, no benefits. You never know if you're going to have a job tomorrow. That's really good for the economy. That's good for having jobs. Some of the most profitable corporations, the ones who's way up on the Fortune 500 list and booming, are the ones that what they call sell manpower, like Manpower Incorporated, selling temps, which is terrific for making labor markets flexible. It happens to destroy everybody's life, but that doesn't really matter. Again, the similarity to the third world is very close. Back in this is what's called economic health, and when this happens, you call it an economic miracle, another technical term. So, for example, Brazil was a terrific economic miracle under the neo-Nazi generals that we installed with great self-adulation back in the 60s. And by 1971, it had become the Latin American darling of the business community. And the president, the general who ran the place, pointed out that the economy is doing fine. It's just that the people aren't. We have a Nobel Prize winner who just won the Nobel Prize last time, Robert Lucas of Chicago. And he was interviewed by the Wall Street Journal and said, "We've been doing great and have been for a long time." He didn't even bother to add what the Brazilian general did. It's only the people who aren't doing well. What he means by we is the top 5% or maybe top 10%, and that's right. We've been doing great. We're doing fine. The economy's fine. By now, we don't even worry about the fact that the people aren't doing so well. I won't bother repeating the statistics, which you know, and he knows perfectly well. Okay, that's economic miracles. We're now beginning to get one ourselves. What about privatization? Well, again, the effects of that are obvious. So, say, in the latest economic miracle in Mexico, privatization meant, as usual, handing over public assets to friends of the president or other rich people or international investors at a fraction of their cost. And in fact, in Mexico, the number of billionaires during the economic miracle went up even faster than the percentage of people on the poverty line, as some were doing well and the people didn't happen to be doing so well. In fact, it was a catastrophe for them, even before the collapse. So that's privatization. What about property rights? Increase of property rights. That's very important. In fact, it's a critical aspect of the what are called misleadingly the free trade agreements, which actually have strong protectionist elements in them, Uruguay Round and NAFTA and so on. And one of them is increase of intellectual property rights. I won't go into the details, but what it amounts to is guaranteeing that major corporations have a monopoly on the technology and knowledge of the future. And they extended those by various devices so that it's about 50 years before you can interfere with owned property, which comes from public subsidy, usually through research, and then is handed over to some private corporation, and nobody else is allowed to touch it. So increasing property rights has a big effect, highly protectionist measure, which is central to the new trade agreements, and has a long-lasting effect way down the road on organizing the international economy and who gains and who loses. Last element of the Washington Consensus is reducing trade barriers. And here there's another scam that you ought to keep your eyes on. What's called trade in economics is a very odd notion. So, for example, if Ford Motor Company moves parts from Indiana to Illinois for assembly and then moves them back to Indiana, that's not called trade. But if Ford Motor Company takes parts made in Indiana and moves them across the border to Mexico, where you get much cheaper labor and you don't have to worry about pollution and so on, and they get reassembled in Mexico and then sent back to, say, Illinois for value added, that's called exports and imports. Never had anything to do with the Mexican economy, or in fact any economy. It was all internal to the Ford Motor Company, but it's exports and imports. So how big an element is that? Well, about 50% of U.S. trade. So about 50% of what's called U.S. trade is actually internal to individual corporations, meaning controlled by a very visible hand with all sorts of methods around for distortion of markets and robbery and so on and so forth. And it's about the same for Japan. And for the world, it's hard to get numbers, but what's estimated for the world is around 40% of trade. Agreements like, say, the Uruguay Round, GATT, if that increases what's called trade, what it actually does is increase investor rights. That is, it increases the power of transnational corporations. You have to really look pretty closely to figure out what the effect is on trade in any meaningful sense. For example, it may increase cross-border operations, but decrease trade in a meaningful sense of trade, meaning something that's not under the control of kind of corporate mercantilism. Going on with this, it's perhaps worth noticing that the very concept of capitalism and markets has virtually disappeared. So, for example, if you take the current issue of Foreign Affairs, there's an article by Joseph Nye of the Kennedy School, I think maybe he's the dean of the Kennedy School, who explains that there's a big new weapon in the hands of American diplomats. American diplomats, he says, diplomacy has a force multiplier. And the reason is because of the attraction of democracy and free market enthusiasm.